And as you just heard, we're going to actually record this call. Not our usual practice, but because there's been so much interest in it, we wanted to make sure that we can provide both the materials and the conversation in for a larger community. So we are going to basically put the recording will be on GSER's website along with the materials that were distributed in advance of the meeting, and we'll also be sending it out to others who have requested it. So we thank you all in advance for agreeing to do that, and we hope that you'll find the information in these two really incredibly timely and important reports will be helpful in your work. As you know from the many emails that I send you all, we are going to be, this call is going to be on the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration, and it's going to really highlight two, as I said, new reports. We have three speakers. I'm going to introduce them by name and institution. Their bios were distributed to you before. You're going to talk they're basically going to follow each other in the order in which I'm going to announce them. But initially, we're also going to have a roundup like we usually do about what's happening on immigration at the federal level by Tom Dowlett, who is the Vice President, Center for American Progress. After he finishes his relatively short overview, we're going to actually have then be followed by Kim Rubin, who is the Senior Fellow at the State and Local Finance Initiative of the Urban Institute. And then Tom will report on the results from the Center for American Progress. Sorry, we get a little background noise, and we'll fix that. And then last, we're going to hear from Bob Mirabout, who is Executive Director of the Idaho Dairymen Association, who will comment on the findings from the report. So we're going to try to mute the background noise so that we don't have it. It might be on someone who is speaking, but we'll try and fix that while we are starting with Tom. So Tom, do your roundup, and then we'll go into the deep discussion that we hope to have today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Geri, and thanks everyone for calling in as always. So I just had a couple of points to highlight before we start into the two reports. One of them is just going to be what I often do, sort of a state of play now with DAPA, and sort of where we are with the Texas case. So I think since our last call, I think folks probably know that the Supreme Court in the beginning of this month denied the government's petition for rehearing in the case. And so what that means is that the case will now be returning back to Judge Haenen's court for further proceedings. And as far as sort of the procedural rundown of the case goes, at this point we would expect Judge Haenen, once he picks up the proceedings again, to potentially proceed with discovery, depending on what Texas thinks may be of interest to them in discovery. And another possible option that people have been considering is whether or not the government could ask Judge Haenen to go ahead and issue a permanent injunction based on the record that's already been established in the case. Because as you may remember, the case was at the Supreme Court and on appeal only in a preliminary injunction posture. And so they really do need to issue a permanent injunction for the case to get back to the Fifth Circuit again and eventually then back to the Supreme Court. So while we're waiting for Judge Haenen's next move, two lawsuits have now been filed actually in New York and Chicago on behalf of DACA beneficiaries who received 3-year work authorizations under the new memo and then had those 3-year work authorizations yanked away by DHS as a result of the injunction. And essentially what those cases are arguing is that first and foremost, there are the regulations that apply to when work authorizations can be taken away weren't followed essentially, and so the way that DHS went about taking them away wasn't appropriate, and that in any event, the injunction that was issued by Judge Haenen shouldn't reach people who are in those jurisdictions, especially those jurisdictions in which the states have not joined the lawsuits challenging the policy, and so we'll see. Those cases are going to take a number of months to work their way through even just the district court process, but there was an initial positive hearing in the Eastern District of New York by a judge who was very skeptical of the idea that a single judge in Texas could essentially prohibit him from issuing a decision when he has a real case in controversy before him. So we'll see, and I think that's something that we'll be looking for in the first couple months probably of next year. On the detention front, there is some news that's been happening there that I think could be of interest to people. Two big things are coming out at this point, basically. So last year, DHS and ICE jointly created an advisory committee on family residential centers, and the committee was tasked with basically developing recommendations for the best practices at family detention centers, including in education, language, intake procedures, medical care, access to counsel, that sort of thing. So in March, once the committee was constituted, it was tasked with that responsibility, and in late September, essentially, they put out a report that was their draft report, and they had a hearing on it earlier this month, at which I think there was like 8 or 9 hours of testimony, basically, from advocates. Director Saldana spoke as well from ICE. And the report, really, the recommendations from the report are really a frontal assault on the practice of family detention itself. The report begins by saying that its first and most important recommendation is that DHS, quote, simply avoid detaining families. And the report then goes through a handful of ways in which, through a variety of policies, DHS could achieve essentially that goal of not putting families into expedited removal, putting them into ordinary removal proceedings. And recognizing that, and this is what the recommendation says essentially, that DHS should adopt a posture that detaining children is virtually never in their best interests. So that's a report that's gone into DHS at least, and we'll see what comes out of that process. In August of this year, after DOJ announced that it was going to phase out the use of private prisons by the Bureau of Prisons, DHS announced, and there was a lot of pressure, I think, on them to do this, that they would create within the Homeland Security Advisory Council a subcommittee to specifically explore whether DHS should similarly end its use of private prisons. And so that subcommittee really has very little time to do its work, basically, but they have been having meetings. They've been having conversations with experts in detention, with some of the immigration advocates as well, and I'm sure plenty of other folks that I am not aware of. And they will be issuing a report to the full council sometime next month, and the full council can't take an action until they've had a public hearing as well. So we would expect there to be another public hearing probably in late November or perhaps in early December. Now, one thing that's helpful to mention when we're considering all this stuff is that even while DHS was getting this recommendation from the Advisory Committee on Family Residential Centers saying you should stop detaining families, they actually just modified their contract with Corrections Corporation of America, which is the private prison company that runs the Dilley facility. And under that new agreement, the facility will operate through 2021. And so that's creating a lot of concern, I think, among a lot of the groups that are wondering if that means that both of these efforts, basically the effort to look at family detention and the effort to look at private prisons, is really a genuine effort. Also, the Wall Street Journal just reported earlier this month that ICE expects to have, by the end of this month, about 42,000 people in custody, which, as you all know, far outpaces what they're budgeted to detain on any given day. They receive appropriated funds sufficient to support to detain approximately 34,000 people in custody on any given day, and so being 8,000 above that is really a pretty huge number. And we know from work that Human Rights First and some other groups have done that a large percentage of these detainees, an increasing number, are asylum seekers as well. So that's another area of cause for concern. So those are probably the two big buckets that I want to talk about, and I can answer questions later on if it's helpful.
Thanks, Tom. That was really helpful. I really appreciate it. And I think let's keep questions until the end, because then we'll unmute you all, and then folks can ask. And then we'll also, on the webinar, you can actually also write questions to me, and we'll also use that as a way. So, Kim, we're going to go to you now. What I neglected to say, which I should have in the beginning, was that this new National Academies of Sciences report was funded by one of our close colleague foundations, the MacArthur Foundation, which we appreciate, and Tara Magner, who's been helpful in actually convening this webinar. Kim, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to talk about our report. So I don't know how many of you know, but last month the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released the report, The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration. It was my privilege to serve with about a dozen other people who are experts in different parts of this field on a 2-year panel to sort of look at these questions. So as just noted, this, oh, sorry, I'm having trouble with my slides. This is sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. We ran out of some money, and we received some additional funding from the President's Funds from the National Academies. And so what we were doing is, this panel examined and the report addresses how the immigrant population has changed over the last 20 years and what the economic and fiscal consequences of these changes have been. So I'm going to go through my PowerPoints pretty fast. There are more slides than I could possibly cover in the amount of time I have. But if you want to look back at them, this will give you sort of more comprehensive set of questions and answers to what we did. It's a 500-page report. Can't cover it all in 20 minutes, but I'll do my best by talking really fast. Also, if there is anything that's unclear, feel free to either ask me during the webinar or also my email's on the front of this, so feel free to reach out and just let me know. So in addition to describing how immigration patterns have changed recently, we also look at the large body of research evidence about what has been happening and sort of what the effects of immigrants on the economy and the fiscal bottom line of the country is. In addition to sort of reviewing the work that was done on the fiscal side, we actually did some new research where we actually estimated both what we think the fiscal bottom line is, sort of if you look at costs versus benefits or taxes paid versus expenditures received, both for the nation as a whole and then also state by state for the different states for state and local financing and spending. So the questions that we look at are, how does immigration affect the U.S. economy? How does immigration impact labor markets? What are the other ways that immigration impacts the economy? How does immigration affect public revenue and spending? What are the fiscal effects on federal and state budgets at the aggregate national level, both at a point in time and over time? And how does this affect the fiscal picture in states? So in terms of numbers, today, nearly 1 in 4 Americans are immigrants or second generation. So the foreign-born have more than doubled since 1990 and are now 13% of the population. By immigrants or foreign-born, we're including all persons living in the United States who were born in another country, naturalized U.S. citizens, green card holders, those on temporary visas, refugees, and those who are undocumented. So it's the whole set of people. Currently, more than 40 million people living in the United States were born in other countries, and an almost equal number have at least one foreign-born parent. So that's together, this first generation and second generation individuals make up almost 1 in 4 Americans. And as I'm going to get to later, a growing share of our working age population. Looking ahead, for the foreseeable future, nearly all of the growth in our workforce is going to come from immigrants and their offspring. So starting in 2020, the only individuals who are adding to the number of people we have working in the country are actually immigrants and their children. It might not be obvious from current, media attention, but while the number of unauthorized immigrants has increased since 1995, if we look at the more recent history, you'll actually see that the number of unauthorized populations actually peaked in 2007, shrank in 2009, and it's been about level since that. That's not saying nobody's coming in. It's basically saying that while we have about 11 million, it's been fairly constant with about 300 to 400,000 undocumented immigrants arriving each year, but an equal number leaving the country. We also have about an estimated 1 million legal permanent residents joining the United States each year. So that's sort of our baseline of who are immigrants and who are in our study in terms of foreign-born. So if we look at how things have changed over time, we actually find that recent immigrants are more educated than immigrants of the past. Native education has also increased, so people who are here are also have a higher level of education, but we're finding that more people have higher levels of education. We also find that immigrants are overrepresented in two groups: the group that have less than a high school degree and those with more than a BA. So, and as I said before, immigrants also make up a larger share of our labor force, increasing from about 11% to 16%. Oops. Okay, I'm going. Okay, so, and because U.S. labor force growth has slowed because of the aging of the baby boom, that means that immigrants are going to supply prime age workers who are going to help counterbalance that aging population. So basically, we're going to have fewer people who are entering the labor force rather than retiring in the Native population, but that's going to be supplemented and replaced by immigrants and children of immigrants. The other interesting factor that's different than when we did this 10 years ago is immigrants are going into more geographically dispersed places. So they're moving to states and communities that historically had fewer immigrants. So while in 1975 to 80, about 2/3 of immigrants were in the top 5 states, now that number is slightly less than a half. So about half of immigrants are now in California, New York, Texas, Florida, and Illinois, which is down from where we were before. So now I'm going to talk about what we find in terms of what it means for native-born and for employment and wages. So what does it mean for the economy overall? So what we find is that in general, the impact of immigration on either the wages or employment levels of native-born workers is very small. This in part is due to the fact that immigration is just one of many factors that are affecting native wages and employment. So there's also technological change and changes in trade. But we're finding that the impact of immigration is actually really small on the wages and employment levels of native-born workers. To the extent that there are negative effects, and this varies a lot across the different studies that we looked at, groups that are closest in terms of substitution to low-skilled immigrants are most likely to experience negative wage effects. So that would be prior immigrants and then also native-born high school dropouts. We also find similar effects on employment, where we find little evidence overall in the overall employment levels of native workers, but there are some negative effects for subgroups, namely those that are prior immigrants, and we have found some effects on numbers of hours worked by native teens. So people who are entering the workforce might find some competition from immigrants and new immigrants. If we stop and look at high-skilled immigrants who have also increased in the numbers that are coming, we found positive impacts on the economy overall and on the employment and wages of all workers. So not just low-skilled workers who we would expect would be complements, but also on high-skilled workers who are native to the country. And part of that has to do with the fact that we feel that high-skilled immigrants are increasing innovation and productivity in the country, and there are also complementarities with the jobs and the skills that native-born workers who are highly educated have. So the fact that immigrants are more likely to get degrees in STEM, so in science and technology, and it could be that they're working with other college-educated native-born people who are now getting more of a return to less science degrees. Oh, okay, sorry. And so we're basically finding that there's been a positive effect on economic growth. High-skilled immigrants have boosted our capacity for innovation and technological change. They actually have increased patenting per capita, so that increases productivity growth. Immigrants are also disproportionately likely to start new businesses. So there's a lot of entrepreneurship where they open both small businesses and also things in tech. So, and more importantly, or as importantly to that, is immigration is going to supply prime age workers who have helped counterbalance our aging populations. So if you think about a country like Japan that also has an aging native-born population, we're actually in better shape because we actually have workers coming in who can help replace those workers. you would think. So the other thing I want to say, and then I'm going to switch on to the fiscal effects of immigrants, is there are other positive economic effects of immigration that you all probably know this better than I do, right? So basically, if you have immigration, we also see reduction in prices of certain consumer goods that people like because the costs of labor are cheaper, and there are actually people who are willing to take these jobs in childcare, food preparation, house cleaning, repair, construction. There's also, especially in some local markets that are losing populations, immigrants in the second generation are a source of demand in housing markets. So the only thing that is sort of allowing certain people to sell their houses or maintain house prices, which is sort of the main place where we have wealth for most middle class families, is because immigrants are coming into some of those locales and buying these houses. The other point is that immigrants, because they are more mobile and they're more willing to move both in terms of where they come when they arrive in the United States, but also are more willing to move to other places over time, help keep our labor and our economy more fluid. So the fact that immigrants are more likely to move to places where labor is needed helps offset differences across the country in terms of where you need employment or employees. So if I now switch focus to the fiscal side, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at ways that immigrants contribute to revenues by paying taxes versus the fact that they contribute to expenditures and they get certain public services. Before I go further, it's important to note that independent of immigration, we underwent a big change in our federal fiscal bottom line between when the last study was done in the 1990s and now. We went from a rare point in history when we were running federal surpluses to a point where we're running deficits. So in 2013, the federal deficit was estimated to be over $1 trillion. This means that if we're looking at average benefits versus average costs, so we're looking at taxes paid versus spending, and we're including all of what's going on at the federal, state, and local level, immigrants are going to cost more in terms of services received than taxes paid, but so are second and third generation people. So in a place where you're running deficits, everybody looks like they're not a good deal because we're just not paying enough in taxes in the country overall to cover our expenses. So the first thing I want to do is talk about sort of what we did in the report. So we actually looked at 3 different groups. We looked at first generation. So these are the individuals who are born abroad, and this is the immigrant group. Then we have a second generation. So these are native-born people who have at least one immigrant parent. And so they're a subgroup of the native-born, but we want to pay attention to them because in some ways they're here because their parents came in the first place. And so as we're going through things and as we look at costs, we're going to find out, and this is previewing where I'm going, immigrants tend to cost more than they're paying in taxes if we attribute the cost of education for their kids to them. The importance of looking at second generation is we actually see a return. So once their kids are older, they're actually paying taxes, and they're paying taxes and receiving benefits at a lower rate than third plus generation. So they're actually achieving more and paying more in taxes than they're getting in benefits, more than the rest of native-born people who are the third plus generation. So these are people who are, they could have grandparents that are immigrants, but they could also be people who've come over whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. So basically we're differentiating people who are immigrants, the children of immigrants, and then everybody else when we're talking about the results we have. Okay, and now, so there are a number of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about immigration and actually studying the cost of immigration. So first, it's how we consider the cost of public goods. So public goods are things like defense. They're things that we don't necessarily think increase in cost if you add another person. So in general, we think of these costs as not being on the margin. They're average costs. We present results that show both average costs and marginal costs, and part of what the difference is how do we allocate these costs. So in general, if we allocate these public good costs to immigrants, they look more expensive. But if we actually recognize that those costs wouldn't necessarily be any lower if we didn't have immigrants here, and so we only assign the marginal costs, we end up finding that immigrants are a huge benefit to the country. The other thing we have to think about, and this is getting back to something I said earlier, is how should we allocate the cost of immigrant children and dependents? So one approach is to bundle their costs with their parents. So you could imagine that you have about half of the second generation are children. If we actually just allocate their costs and their taxes paid to that second generation, they look really expensive because they're kids. What we do instead is we bundle the costs of kids to their parents. So if you're an immigrant and you have a native-born child, we're allocating those costs up to you. If we instead, and so that increases the costs to people who have children. If instead we actually allocate those costs to society as a whole, because you could imagine that education is an investment in future productivity, the numbers would be cheaper. In most of our estimates, we actually allocate children to their parents, and we allocate this as a cost. So this is partly why numbers look high. And then we also do things a number of ways. This is what happens when you have a lot of economists answering these questions. We look at things at a static method, which is a year-by-year basis, and then we also do it on a dynamic basis where we're looking at things over a 75-year period. And so in the report, you'll see both sets of results. I am going to skip ahead to what we're doing. I already just said this. So in the results that I'm presenting, and especially when we get into the state-by-state estimates, there were three factors that actually are a major determinant of why individuals would cost a lot. One of them is age. So people cost or pay taxes in different ways over their life cycle. So during early years, when they're actually going to school, they're expensive. During the working years, they actually pay more in taxes than they receive in services, and so they actually look like they're very attractive to the fiscal bottom line. And then in later years, when they're actually retired and they're receiving Social Security and Medicare, they're again expensive. And so that's sort of going to affect what things look like in terms of costs. And so this picture actually shows that people are expensive when they're young and when they're old, and then they actually add money to the fiscal bottom line during those middle working years. The other thing that affects how we measure costs are how many kids you have. So if you have more kids or dependents, if we're actually allocating those expenses to parents, it means that people with kids look less good than people without kids. So if you have more children, especially at the state and local level, you cost more money because education is expensive. Finally, depending on your education, people with lower education typically pay less in taxes because they earn less money, whereas people with more education typically have higher incomes and they're paying more in taxes. So basically the three things that affect how any individual is going to contribute to the bottom line just for themselves in a one-year period is going to depend on their age, the number of kids they have, and their education and income. And so what we end up finding is overall that immigrants have a lower fiscal contribution than native-born, especially at the state and local level. But the fact that they're more concentrated in the prime working ages means that that raises their contribution. They're less well-educated, so that lowers their contributions. And then the fact that they have more children means that that also lowers the amount, that increases the amount of benefits they're getting because of the amount of money that's being spent on education. So again, this isn't taking into account that expenditures on education later will end up reaping more tax revenue for both the federal government and state and local governments, but in any point in time, that's what we see. The other thing that's important to look at is, as we went through this state by state, second generation, so those children of immigrants are the ones that actually contribute the most to the fiscal bottom line. So they actually pay more in taxes and receive less in benefits than both immigrants, but then also plus third plus generation individuals controlling for age and also at a specific point in time. So now I'm just going to, so basically, again, whether immigrants cost more than they're contributing depends a lot on whether we're thinking about them on an average cost approach or on a marginal cost approach. If we actually only allocate their marginal costs to immigrants rather than those fixed costs that we think the country is going to have to pay anyway, they actually are benefiting more in terms of how much they're contributing in terms of taxes versus how much is being spent on them. So whether we're looking at average versus marginal makes a huge difference, especially at the federal level, to whether immigrants are a benefit for the country versus a cost to the country. Okay, I'm going to skip the dynamic. So I'm going to skip this 75-year estimates. That's basically also showing that once you take into account the value of the taxes paid by kids of immigrants, they actually look much better than if we're just doing it at a point in time. I want to take some time to just go quickly through what's different in this report is we actually present results for individual states. And so consistent with the national level analysis, we find that first generation adults are more costly than second and third generation. Of the three groups, the second generation contributes the most to the bottom line of state and local fiscal balances. But this also varies a lot across states. And so what seems to matter? So in Chapter 9, we actually present results on a state-by-state basis. So if you actually want to look at sort of what it means for your state, you can actually go to the report, and I could also put that chapter up on a website to give you access to it. It actually includes state and local taxes and spending. And what we do is we arrange the states by size of immigrant population. So we start with California at the top, and we end with West Virginia at the bottom. That's partly because some of those states at the bottom, we don't really have huge sample sizes. And so we might not necessarily have enough information to do this. And so what we end up finding is, again, that the cost benefits for each generation and how it varies across states is going to depend on the individual characteristics, so the age of immigrants within the state, the education level, and the number of kids. But it's also going to vary by the state policies in place. States that actually spend more on education are going to actually find that the costs are higher. States that actually rely more on sales taxes and less on income taxes are actually going to find that immigrants are contributing more just because the taxes in place are more regressive. And then again, how we calculate is going to matter a lot. Finally, immigrants are more costly because they have more kids than in other groups. But again, those kids are the ones that are going to be in that second generation that are actually contributing more to taxes and spending. And so I think I've now gone over my time, so I can stop there. The only other points to make is that we do raise questions about whether there should be more transfers of money from the federal government to states, because in general immigrants are pivotal for the federal bottom line just because of increases in Social Security and Medicare benefits, and the fact that having a larger population to spread some of those costs over is going to be really important, while states are picking up most of the costs of education. And by states, I mean state and local governments. And so we want to sort of think about whether there should be transfers across levels of government. But in general, while states might not like the fact that they're spending more, the fact that they're investing in these kids is really important because that's going to be their future generations. And I'll stop.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Kim. That was great. I know we asked a really difficult task to take that huge report and to distill it in a very short period of time, but I think it really did cover the highlights. So we're going to head to Tom now, who's going to talk about the Center for American Progress's report on the economic impacts of removing undocumented immigrant workers. I think I reminded you all in the emails, but just remember we're going to probably go over about 15 minutes today just because there's so much data. So be patient, and we're going to get to call questions at some point. So write them all down. So Tom, you take it away.
Thanks so much, Geri. And there's one thing I did want to say about Kim's report. I mean, there's so much in there. It's 500 pages, and there's I feel like we're all going to be studying it for well over a year, I think, and pulling things out. But one piece that I thought really stood out to me that I think she didn't get to today is, and I think about this because the reason why we did our study is that we are always trying to think about how to not only educate the American public, but also try and help forge a path toward a sensible immigration reform in Congress. And we're always trying to therefore find ways to get to new members, get to new constituencies, and talk to people who should be allies of ours who aren't yet aware of the fact that they really are affected by this in a very serious way. So we did our study to try and get some really granular data on that, and I'll get to that in a second. But one of the things that came out in their study that I thought was really striking is that if you look at the decade that we're currently in, 2010 to 2020, the only reason that we have any positive growth in the working age population in the country during this decade is immigrants and their children. Third generation plus Americans are not growing into the working age population in net. There are as many going in as coming out. In 2020 to 2030, the next decade that we're looking at, but for immigrants and their children entering the working age population, we would actually have a net loss of 7 million in the working age population in the country. And so when you think about what that means for older Americans and the sustainability of our Social Security and Medicare trust funds, and we've always sort of long had that data, I think, but the graphic representation of that, the idea that we would actually would have a shrinkage in our working age population, I think, over the next decade, is really striking, and I think an important way of framing this going forward. But I want to turn to our study as well. So our study was on the economic impacts of removing unauthorized immigrant workers from the country. And we started this, we first brainstormed the idea back in December of last year, although when I first talked to Phil about it here, he said, well, actually, we've actually been talking about doing this for the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's the kind of study that I think we've always wanted to do, but we never really found economists who wanted to build a model as sophisticated as the 2 economists that we worked with ended up building in order to get this information. And so just taking off a little bit, here we go. So immigration policy in the last few years. As you all know, obviously, I think this is a really sort of big picture, top line kind of thing. But in 2012, we had DACA that was announced, and in 2013, that kicked off the effort to get immigration reform after the last presidential election. When that effort was going nowhere at the end in November 2014, the administration announced DAPA and the expansion of DACA, which of course have been held up in the courts. And as I mentioned at the top of this call, just earlier this month, the Supreme Court denied the petition for rehearing to try and break the deadlock. And so we're stuck with where we are right now on that policy. In terms of the unauthorized population today, there are a lot of numbers on this. They all basically center around the same figures, basically. I know that the Center for Migration Studies in New York recently came out with a study finding that there were 10.9 million unauthorized immigrants in the country in 2014. The number that our economists were working off of based on other reports that are out was 11.3 million unauthorized immigrants in the country. But of course, there's many more who are living in mixed status families that have both authorized and unauthorized members, U.S. citizens as well. Because of the stasis, our inability to get immigration reform enacted, while we have seen the unauthorized population in the country, generally speaking, freeze and actually begin to shrink in the last few years, the length of time of the average unauthorized immigrants in the country has just been creeping up and up and up. So the median length of time now is over 13 and a half years. And as you all know from your own work in your own communities, as a result, you have people who are very well settled in our communities, our schools, our families. So this next slide just sort of highlights some of the new big polls that have come out on what Americans think about immigration and the idea of mass deportation. And this is important, I think, because this has been a key issue in the election. And I think one of the main takeaways from this election is going to be whether we want to have an inclusive society or if we want to have a society that embraces, this more sort of pitting one against the other kind of approach to the world. And in fact, the polls show that a very, very small minority of Americans, only 15%, support the idea of mass deportation. And in this latest CNN poll from just last month, a record number of Americans, 88%, supported legislation with an earned path to citizenship. So the idea, when you put the whole package together and explain what that means, that you're not talking about citizenship on day one, but that people are coming forward, registering with the government, paying a fine, passing background checks, and getting on a path through which they can earn legal status and eventually citizenship, people obviously continue to support that idea in increasing numbers. And I think a lot of that is in reaction to the alternative. So our study, what would mass deportation of unauthorized workers mean for the country? Our study finds that of the 11.3 million unauthorized immigrants in the country, about 7 million are in the workforce today, and that's about 5% of our total workforce, which is enormous, of course. The cool thing about our report is that while there have been other studies that have looked at some of the impact of mass deportation or the positive impact of immigrants on a state-by-state or industry-by-industry level, our report was able to actually break it down to a finer degree of granularity than anyone's ever done before. It looks at the impact of mass deportation of unauthorized workers by an industry-by-industry basis within most states. And so you have a lot of really, really fine data on that. So our national findings, on the national level, removing these unauthorized workers would cost the nation over $434 billion annually in gross domestic product. And over a 10-year period, the cumulative loss in GDP would total $4.7 trillion. Because GDP and tax revenue, federal revenue, are generally linked, and obviously workers are paying federal taxes, and that then generates federal revenue. Removing these unauthorized workers from the country would also decrease federal revenue by nearly $900 billion over 10 years. And $900 billion over 10 years is really significant, right? So if you look at just the SNAP program, which is formerly the food stamp program, over the next 10 years, that's projected to cost about $721 billion. The Department of Education, again, Pell Grants, student aid, $68 billion a year. And so $900 billion in foregone federal revenue is an extremely significant amount of money for the federal government to lose. When you break it down by industry now, this provides a not terribly surprising database. So you can look at the industries that have the biggest hit to themselves are agriculture, where you've seen 8.6% loss in the long run in the GDP from within that sector, and leisure and hospitality. And then right behind that, you'll see construction. The difference between short run and long run here, our economists can definitely explain it much better than I can, but the idea essentially is the short run loss is what would happen if you were to take out the labor that these folks are producing all at once. The long run loss is over time, once labor is gone, capital begins to adjust as well. And so you'll see, for instance, farmers won't buy that next tractor, won't maintain their tractor, will sell their tractor. And that means that there's sort of additional inefficiencies taken out of the system, but also additional possible productivity taken out of the system as well. Here's an infographic. We did, because we have so much data, we had nationwide data, but we also have state-by-state infographics just like this. So we have state data that's just like this. But basically what it shows is that $434 billion figure that we mentioned, but it's broken down by all these industries. And one of the really exciting things about this study is you see the things you'd expect to see, right? You see big losses in industries where we know that unauthorized immigrants are more likely to work in agriculture, leisure and hospitality, construction, manufacturing. But you also see big losses in financial activities and professional business services. And part of the reason for that is that even though you don't have a huge number of unauthorized immigrants probably working in those industries, those are actually generally very productive industries. And so even though you're losing a smaller share of the workforce, that share is a very productive share of the workforce. So again, 5% of the workforce being taken out. There's very little historical precedent for that kind of change in the labor supply. During the Great Recession, it's not a direct comparison, but during the Great Recession, the unemployment rate was raised by 4.5%, and obviously that had all kinds of negative consequences for gross domestic product as well. So how would states fare when you look at states? I know a lot of people from California typically call in. Unsurprisingly, California takes the biggest hit from this, over $100 billion annually in GDP generated from the state. And you can see a number of other states there as well. North Carolina, over $10 billion. New York, just over $40 billion in GDP annually. And Texas was the number 2 state at over $60 billion annually. We produced, again, because we have all this data, we have a lot of good graphics and shareables that can help elevate this information. But what I'm showing now on the webinar, a lot of folks on the call probably can't see, but Florida's economy, for instance, when you look at Florida, Florida would lose just under $25 billion in GDP annually. And the three biggest industries in Florida that we hurt would be wholesale and retail trade, financial activities, and leisure and hospitality. And so again, you see financial activities is one of the top industries that's hurt in Florida itself, even though that's not an industry where you would generally see a lot of unauthorized immigrants working. Agriculture is a major hit in Florida as well, but because it's just the overall productivity of the industry in Florida is not quite as high as what you find in some of these other ones as well. Nevada as well. We have some data on Nevada here as well. So the way that we're thinking about this essentially is we're at a crossroads, and that's how we're trying to frame essentially what the National Academy of Sciences did and the work that we're doing and the direction we want to try and go. Right. So we know from the National Academy of Sciences that immigrants broadly are already a very strong net positive for our economy, and that's the status quo. Having said that, we're now at a decision. Sort of, what do we do with the fact that we have 11.3 or 10.9 million unauthorized immigrants in the country, and what do we do with them essentially? Down one road is this idea of mass deportation. We now have a study that goes into and calculates what the impact of that would be of removing just the workers themselves. It's a very conservative study, actually. It's one of the things I think we're excited about. It's a very conservative study. It doesn't get into the cost of actually apprehending, detaining, and removing these workers. It doesn't get into the cost of or the downstream costs to the economy of their unauthorized immigrants who are not in the workforce, right? Their children and their parents, students. It also doesn't get all into the demand side as well. So I mean, there are not just 7 million workers. There are also 11 million consumers in the economy, and they help to sustain the business all around them. And I know that our third caller is going to get into that as well. So that's down one path. Is really sort of economic devastation, setting aside all the social upheaval that would cause. Down the other path is immigration reform, which we've all studied enormously over the years, and we see that immigration reform, both through our own studies and the studies that are done by the Congressional Budget Office, would generate an enormous lift to GDP over a decade. A cumulative $1.2 trillion would reduce the deficit, would increase earnings by Americans, and create hundreds of thousands of new jobs each year. So we rolled out a report in September. We got some good pickup in both English and Spanish language press, and then on October 6th we had a day of action around the country where we and our partner organizations held events or did press calls to try and raise up the information and raise up some of the local data. So last thing I'll say, and then I'll just turn it over to our final speaker. So where do we go from here? Like I said at the very outset of this, our goal really is to try and build additional constituencies and build additional interest from people. So one of the things we plan on doing with this report, essentially with the methodology that was designed, is to come up with now a follow-up piece that's going to be able to look at the economic benefits of legalization, ideally broken down to a similar level of granularity, essentially. So, CAP has done some of this work in the past, but again, this is a different method, and it has a little greater specificity. And so our hope is that come early next year, we'll be able to talk not only about what the economic damage would be through a policy of removing unauthorized workers from various states, from various industries, and from various industries within states, but also what would those states, what would those industries experience if we were to pursue a policy of legalization through legislation. And hopefully then by approaching some of the industry groups, some of the industry press in those states, some of the larger businesses in some of the districts for members who haven't previously engaged in this issue, and showing them essentially what the data shows about what they're already benefiting and how they would benefit even more. That'll begin to increase our ability to speak to people that we haven't previously spoken to in the past. And obviously we're working with partners on that effort as well. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take questions. And thanks, Geri.
Thank you.
The conference has been unmuted.
So thank you, Tom. Excellent. In a very short period of time. Appreciate that. So now we're going to go to Bob Nearabout, who is with the Idaho Dairymen Association, who's going to just do some brief comments on it from his point of view, and then we're going to open up for questions. Thank you. Bob, thank you so much.
Hi. Thanks for having me on. And I guess I'm going to kind of round up because I can touch on both of the previous speakers just from some of the information I'll try and present you. And on short notice that I had. I haven't put a PowerPoint or anything together for you, but the information would be available if you want it. I would like to explain a little bit about the Idaho Dairymen Association and explain to the people that are on the call that this is, for our industry, the #1 issue, and immigration has been our #1 issue from 2007. Not only from an economic point of view, but it's also a moral issue for our board, which really, quite frankly, helps us in getting some things done when you can take it just out of the economic realm and look at some of the other aspects. That moral issue became relevant to our board in about 2007 when ICE was in front of a local grocery store where the Hispanic community normally shop, and if you came out with brown skin, they were asking for your paperwork. And so that just kind of sent a cold cord up their backs, and they said we have to get engaged. And in doing so, they've done our own studies on the economic impact of foreign-born labor in the state of Idaho for our industry, for the dairy industry. They've also gotten engaged with both national and state groups and funded into those groups just under $600,000 since 2007. So they do take this issue as being the primary issue. Everything that was said on the economic side is relevant to our studies and shows in our studies. What I found interesting was in our study there was one other aspect, and if you live in rural communities, your local school district is extremely important to you. And our studies were able to show that there were local school districts that stayed open and viable because of the immigrant labor force that was here in their school children. Although, as it was well pointed out in the first presentation, that does come with a cost. There's also a social benefit to it that many people don't recognize, and I don't believe I've seen recognized in other studies. A lot of our studies looks at the agribusiness impacts in Idaho. And we did a study with the University of Idaho, and they do this every other year. But looking strictly at agriculture, which was brought up before, I think it's important for those on the phone to realize that really agriculture becomes the first rung of a ladder when you come into this country as an immigrant. And you try and move up that ladder, which is understandable. And so with agriculture, after they leave agriculture, after they get settled in, they do look at construction, which was mentioned earlier, and moving up that ladder. But Idaho, as you well know, is a agricultural state, and dairy is the main part of agriculture in Idaho, although we're known more for potatoes than for dairy. But the executive summary that U of I came up with using a base analysis of agribusiness, which is both taking into account the economic activity generated both by processors and producers, that over $27 billion, or 20% of the total state sales, was because of agriculture. Over $10 billion, or 16% of the state's gross state product, was because of agriculture, and 126,000 jobs, or 14% of the total jobs, was because of agriculture. So if you narrow that down just to the dairy industry, we account for $6.6 billion of total sales, $2.2 billion in gross domestic product, $72 million in state tax revenues, and 23,000 jobs, with a labor income of $680 million. So of those 23,000 jobs, 8,400 of them are on our dairies, and the vast majority, I would say 85% of those are held by foreign-born labor. And so when you come down to Tom's piece when he was talking about mass deportation, obviously I think you realize that employers, to the best of their knowledge, are hiring people that are here illegally. They present the proper documentation, and they feel that they are hiring people that are here illegally. But even the Department of Labor and USDA has come out with numbers between 50 and 70% of those involved in agriculture are here illegally. I have a number that's a little higher than that. We'd be closer to 80% based on ICE audits. And an ICE audit is when ICE comes into an operation and asks for the labor records of that operation. They go through and evaluate the legal status of their employees. And of the dairies really across the nation that I'm aware of, and not everybody shares this information, We're closer to right around 80% when you come on a dairy. So when you come back to those 8,400 jobs on dairies held by foreign-born labor, if there was mass deportation, most of those individuals working in the operations would be leaving those operations. And so those value-added jobs above, and quite frankly, my job is one of them. Mine's one of those 23,000 above that, or excuse me, 16,000 above the 8,400, dependent on the foreign-born labor. You have a lot of jobs that leave, both in the processing sector, management sector, banking sector, insurance sector. I mean, just go down the line. And then all those economic numbers are provided you on what we contribute to the state's economy are gone. And agriculture in the state of Idaho is in a mode of not being successful anymore. So I know that's a lot of information to dump on you in a short period of time. I do also think it's important to realize that for agriculture, there is a H-2A visa program, but that is not for full-time agriculture. That's for seasonal and temporary jobs. And so for the dairy industry, there's no visa program for us to go to. For the construction industry, there's no visa program for them to go to. And so we have no available labor force. The unemployment rate in Idaho right now is 3.5%, and in our agricultural areas it's less than 3%. And so really there's a true labor shortage that needs to be filled. Currently part of that is being filled by refugees. We have a major refugee center here in Twin Falls, Idaho. One of our dairy employers has, on his dairy operations, he has over 200 employees, and over 60 of those are now refugees coming from Burma, Somalia, and the Congo. So with that, appreciate being on, and if there's any questions, I'll gladly answer them.
All right, thank you, Bob. I really appreciate that. Am I unmuted? Yeah. Great. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. So y'all who are out there, think about that and be ready to ask. I'd just like to start with one, right, maybe in the economic side. You know, most of you recognize I'm not an economist by any means. I could barely get through math class. But I do wonder, I mean, I don't know, Kim, if you've done any projections, too, about the changing work patterns that is potentially coming up. You know, this whole question now about mechanization and the Internet. Obviously, some industries will not have that. But how do you calculate, you know, sort of in the future of work idea that some of the jobs that are currently in the workforce may not be here in, like, say, 10 years?
And that's a great question, and we didn't actually look at that. Partly what we did on the economic side is we actually looked at all the work that has been done. So folks that have fairly involved literature review of all the work that's been done by economists and different people looking at sort of what the effects on the economy are. I think one of the points we think is really important to make is that while people might feel like they have less economic security and they're attributing a lot of that to immigrants, it isn't really coming from that. And so part of that is coming from the fact that we have more technology. I think the one thing that is really clear is it's increasingly important for people to have more education, right? So for people to sort of have access to jobs and better jobs, I think education is going to need to fill into that. And then we've seen some bifurcation of certain types of jobs where, especially if you see at the lower skill level, and I don't mean that it's unskilled, because I actually think that it takes a tremendous amount of skill and perseverance to do some of these jobs that we think are largely being filled by immigrants, namely if you think about child care and if you think about long-term care for the elderly. A lot of that is being, you know, those are disproportionately being, those jobs are being held by immigrants. And so in some cases, we will see that technology is going to affect the need for employees. But in other ways, there are certain jobs that are basically going to require individuals to have them.
Great, thank you. So any other questions out there from folks? Otherwise, I always have some. So anybody have a question?
Hey, Geri, this is Andrew.
Okay, Andrew, go.
I've got a question, Kim. I'm curious what plans you guys have for potentially trying to break up pieces of the study to get it out into more digestible, smaller bits, especially some of the state-level data, which seems like it could be great for state-based groups to essentially sort of present case studies in their own experiences they've had with growing levels of immigrants in places like the South, and how that, how they can tell that story of the economic impact of immigration.
So from the point of view of the National Academy, I'm not sure there's a lot going on in that. From my personal perspective, and I might need to send you a check afterward. So the work and the people I work with at Urban, one of the things that we are most interested is in trying to translate that work into things that are more understandable and sort of do something similar to what Tom did in terms of putting that information into a more digestible form that's sort of, having state-by-state fact sheets or things like that. One of the things I also didn't cover, and part of the reason I think for certain states you need to be careful with the data we're looking at, is one of the recommendations we do make is to ask for better data on this topic. So one of the things that is a limitation for what you can do and how disaggregated you can get the information is we found that finding out information about where parents are from is really important. So being able to look at that second generation is really important. And in the data you would think to use to do this, which is the American Community Survey, which is sort of what we're now using instead of the long-form census, they don't ask questions about where your parents are born. And so we mainly are using current population survey data because it's the best data we have to do this. But there are limits in sample sizes. So part of the reason I don't think we can get into a lot of detail for certain states is because we're limited on the data side. But at the Urban Institute where I work and with my colleagues, what we're looking for is to try and get some of that information out from the study, but then also pair it with information about sort of what the policies are in place in different states to try and decompose some of why there are these differences across different places.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Maybe Tom and Bob, or even for all of you actually, because one of the big arguments always is about the economic data is that there are American native-born workers would be more willing to take those jobs, especially if they paid more in some fields. I was just in Milwaukee where there's an unemployment rate of like 60% of African American youth, for example, right? So what's your arguments, or how do we discuss that about folks who have been, who are unemployed and aren't able to get jobs, and but also are there people lining up to do some of these jobs in any case? Well, it's a complicated question, but
if Bob wants, Bob can certainly start to answer that with his just personal experience, certainly in the industry as well.
So I'll start. So the answer is there's not people lining up for the jobs, and frankly not second generation immigrants, not the children of the first generation really aren't lining up for the jobs. Starting pay on a dairy right now is between $12 and $14 an hour. I know some of the top dairies are paying $18 an hour. We have tried to form some training programs with a local community college. It's working with large animals, and the average cow is going to go 1,300 to 1,500 pounds. It does take a special skill set. You do need to know how to work with animals, and so we are trying to develop programs in case there are individuals that might want to work in our operations, but it's difficult to find. We quite frankly, the only ones who will apply are foreign-born labor. Now, with the refugees, they have a deep incentive. They have less than 6 months, I believe it is, till self-sufficiency or till they lose their programming. And so there's a real incentive for them to get engaged, and so that they do. I don't think raising the pay price higher or the hourly rate higher will change that outcome.
Thank you.
And
Tom,
also,
do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can just jump in a couple of things. One, it is true at this point now that unemployment is still low across the board, and our authors mentioned that in our report. So it's not actually clear that there will be a glut of workers interested in taking these jobs, particularly those jobs that are itinerant or more migrant in nature. Right? You actually do have people already now, frankly, even in our current economy, who are working, multiple jobs, working many hours. It's not clear they'd be interested in taking on still more jobs or more hours. Second, one thing, and this does go to something that Bob mentioned in his presentation. It's not the kind of thing where if you just take these workers out of the workforce, the jobs just sit there, folks plug into them, and it all, it's a seamless transition. What ends up happening essentially is that when you remove unauthorized workers from the workforce, it has an impact on the industry as a whole, on the viability of those businesses, and on the upstream and downstream businesses that rely upon that industry. And so, when a big farm decides that it's lost a chunk of its workforce and doesn't, think it needs a new tractor anymore, doesn't need new farm equipment, that has an impact on the people who make those tractors, who design those tractors, who sell them, who maintain them. And so it's a complicated system that has impact down the road as well. And the final thing is, frankly, we have some case studies of this, right? So Arizona was a state that put in place a harsh employment verification law that was designed specifically to drive unauthorized immigrants out of the state. And a study that Moody's Analytics did last year that I think was it was used by people on all sides of the immigration debate. But one of the big findings was that, yes, while it was successful in essentially making a number of unauthorized immigrants leave the state, it also decreased employment in the state overall. The employment in the state dropped by 2.5% because of the law. And so there were actually fewer jobs just to go around, not more jobs.
Great, thank you. I have one last question since we're getting close, but if anybody else has one out there. So one thing I was curious about, and given this is sort of obviously a toxic environment we've had in the last 18 months or so around the elections, it's been very, and we also seem to be living in a fact-free zone these days. I'm just curious, as you all take this data to policymakers, either you, Bob, in Idaho, for example, or Tom or Kim at the federal levels, do you find that policymakers are actually believing this or interested in it? Does it make any impact? I'm just curious as we potentially are, going to try again for some sort of immigration reform. Will these facts help, I guess, is one question.
So let me give you the Idaho perspective a minute. Obviously, Idaho is a pretty easy state to lobby for in D.C. We only have a total of 4 delegation members, 2 House members, and 2 senators. But they're more influenced by what's coming into their office from the anti-immigration individuals than by the facts of what we can present them. And so if they're having a 900 to 1, and which was during the Senate debate is the numbers that they were giving us, 900 opposed to immigration, pretty much had a deport them attitude versus 1 saying we have to do it. That does drive their policy. So I think it's critical, and I think it was said earlier in the phone conversation that it's critical to develop your support, and it's critical to develop support right now for 2017. So all the agribusinesses that Tom's referencing or that I referenced that are impacted by the foreign-born labor force who have been sitting on the sidelines and have not been getting involved and engaged in the debate with legislators, or at least informing the legislators of where they sit. They become a critical part for us to have future success, at least in Idaho.
And I'll sorry, go ahead. Was that Kim?
Yeah.
But do you want to go first?
No, you can go.
So I was going to say, so it's been interesting. This report has a lot of information in it, and some of it is positive and some of it is negative. And we've actually had a better response with people wanting to know what we're saying. Part of that may have ironically come from the fact that a couple of people broke the embargo on the report and came out with numbers that were just wildly inaccurate for what we're actually saying. And we've actually gotten more sympathy from people who I thought would be more hostile to sort of what we're coming up with from sort of the Judiciary Committee and stuff, in part because those immediate numbers were just sort of so far-fetched. Like they were based on sort of basic economic theory. And then I think people in general find, although some people are skeptical when we make the point about the fact that the number of undocumented immigrants hasn't really changed over the last few years, that there's some flow, but on net it's been pretty constant. And then, we've gotten some, sympathy about the fact that you need people to be in your labor force. Though there's been less of that given what's going on with the presidential campaign, where you kind of want to say, you can't actually increase growth if you have no people to do that, right? So I think it's been a mixed bag, but it's been more positive in some ways because I think that there was some pretty harsh reaction at the beginning.
Okay, Tom, do you want a final word?
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say I guess I have two thoughts. I mean, one is, coming out of this election, I do think that who knows what the narrative is going to be coming out of this election. I think it's becoming in some ways sort of harder and harder to understand exactly how to interpret what will likely end up happening or what may happen, just because it's gotten so complicated. But I certainly think that one big message coming out of this election is going to be this idea of sort of an inclusive America versus an America that pits one side against each other. And so I strongly expect that we're going to see, and we're going to see it probably from leading Republicans, frankly, in the Senate especially, pushing for the idea that this now opens a window for immigration reform that we have to now take advantage of. So I think the conversation will be upon us. And another big theme coming out of the election, I think, is going to be some amount of economic anxiety from American voters. And I think being able to try and speak to that with some of the data that Kim's come up with is going to be helpful. But I think it's important to translate, and so that's why I think something like that visual representation, the chart I was referring to about the critical importance of immigrants and their children to sustain the working age population of the country, and what that means for actual older Americans who are relying upon social services. I think that's going to be an important thing to be able to translate to broaden our constituencies. And the last thing, as far as sort of how it's will be received. I mean, we all know that we're finding a way through the House of Representatives is going to be the biggest challenge, as it so often has been. And I think what Bob was saying is really helpful context. And so, it may not be the case, frankly, that though we have produced this data, we're the best people to go out and start shopping around people. I think it's going to be important for us to work in partnership with our friends and business coalitions that are able to identify, and we can all work together to identify, what are the 60 offices we really want to reach, and who are the biggest businesses in those 60 districts, and what's the data we can present to them, both from our study regarding mass removal, from our study forthcoming regarding the economic benefits of legalization, frankly, from the NASS study of, what have immigrants meant to your state already? What do they currently mean to your state? And try to engage people who haven't previously engaged before to really step up in district and in D.C. to tell their representatives, look, this is something that actually affects our bottom line. We think it's important for you to take a step on this. And so I think that's going to be the next phase of us trying to sort of activate essentially or put this data into action. And I think it's going to be important, and I think it's going to be potentially effective. But we've got a big fight on our hands, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And so I think we're all going to be trying to find different ways of approaching it.
Well, it's our end of our call time, but I want to thank you all for giving us a huge amount of data and information that I think will, frankly, be probably as helpful going forward. I think you said, Tom, we're going to probably be thinking about the NAS report for the next year. But if you remember, I think the 97 report was had to withstand a couple of decades, actually. So I think these reports tend to be the gift that keeps on giving, and we really appreciate that. I think you should both give Bob some really specialized information on Idaho, given his great comments today. We really appreciate that. I think, frankly, there was so much interest in the call, and the fact that we really didn't get into detail about particular particular states other than Idaho, maybe we'll do a follow-up call specifically on the dates on certain states, because I think that would be really helpful for folks. And in the meantime, I just want to thank REA again from GSER for co-sponsoring and working with us, and for all of you for participating. The information will be available on the GSER website, including the audio of this call. We will also forward it around to you all. If anybody has information or questions that you'd like to give to our speakers, email me directly and I'll put you in touch. Again, thank you all, and I think hopefully you all have a good day, and thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.